Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from some of the most remote mountain ranges across the country. These are accounts from people who went up into those high, silent places, hikers, hunters, workers, people just trying to get away from the noise of ordinary life and came back changed, or barely came back at all. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Now turn off the lights and let's begin. Story 1. The summer I turned 24, my uncle left me a piece of property up in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana. I'd only been there twice, once when I was maybe 8, and once when I was 15 and angry about everything, so I barely paid attention. The property was mostly steep hillside, a dry creek bed that ran during snowmelt, and a small cabin my uncle had built himself sometime in the 70s. Not much, but it was mine now, and I figured I should at least see what I was dealing with before I decided to sell it. I drove up from Missoula on a Thursday, or maybe a Friday. I want to say Friday because I remember the road being busy until about an hour in, then going completely dead. I had a cooler in the back seat with enough food for 4 days, a duffel bag, and a box of my uncle's things I was supposed to sort through. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 12 miles were on a gravel road that was barely a road at all, more like a suggestion of where a road had once been. My uncle's old Subaru, which I'd inherited along with everything else, scraped bottom twice on the bigger rocks. I got there around 4 in the afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, just one main room, a sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a narrow porch that looked out over a slope dropping into thick Douglas fir. The air smelled like pine resin and something underneath that I kept trying to name. Not rot, not animal, just old, like the smell of a room that's been closed a long time. I spent the first evening going through the box. My uncle's things were unremarkable, some old paperback westerns, a coffee can full of screws and nails sorted by size, a pair of reading glasses, a laminated card with a fishing regulation chart on it, 3 years out of date. I found a journal, which I set aside to look at later, and then never did look at. I should probably say that felt significant in hindsight, but honestly at the time I just forgot about it. I made a can of chili on the wood stove, sat on the porch until the light went and listened to the trees. Wind came through in slow waves, a woodpecker somewhere. The creek made no sound because it was dry. I slept fine that night, better than fine actually. The second day I walked the property line. My uncle had described it in a letter, up the ridge to a pine with an old survey blaze, east along the ridgeline, down through the rocky section to the creek bed and back up along the creek. He said it took about an hour and a half. It took me almost 3. The rocky section was harder than he'd made it sound, and I kept stopping for no real reason, just pausing and looking at things without knowing why. A clump of pale mushrooms near a rotting log. A place where the soil had slumped and left a raw dirt face about 10 feet wide. Small things. I noticed the first mark on my way back up from the creek. It was on a tree about 6 feet off the ground, a vertical cut in the bark, maybe 8 inches long, and 2 shorter horizontal cuts crossing it. I stopped and looked at it for a while. I told myself it was probably just my uncle marking something a property corner, a good spot to hang a deer. That made sense. I moved on. There were 4 more on the way back to the cabin, all on different trees, all at the same height, all the same shape. I counted them and then tried to uncount them, the way you do when something small is starting to itch at you and you don't want to let it. That night I heard something on the roof. Not heavy, not the sound of an animal landing, more like a dragging, a slow, deliberate scraping from one end of the roof to the other, starting at the peak and moving toward the eave above the porch. I lay in the sleeping loft and stared at the ceiling boards. The sound stopped before it reached the edge. I waited 20 minutes, nothing. I told myself it was a branch. There were no branches that reached the roof. I'd walked all the way around the cabin that morning and noticed that specifically because I'd been thinking about firewood and what was close enough to be a hazard, I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up at dawn with my neck stiff and my sleeping bag twisted around me. The third morning is when I found the trees. I was walking up toward the ridgeline again, not for any particular reason, just to clear my head. About 100 yards above the cabin, I came to a spot I hadn't reached the day before, a small, nearly flat shelf in the hillside surrounded by older pines. The ground there was different from the rest of the slope, softer, and in the middle of the flat spot, 9 or 10 pine saplings had been planted in a rough circle maybe 15 feet across. They weren't growing there naturally. Someone had transplanted them. The soil around each one had been tamped down carefully, and each sapling was roughly the same size, roughly the same species. They formed a circle with an opening on the downhill side. I stood in that opening and looked in. The circle was maybe 15 feet across and empty except for a depression in the middle, a shallow bowl shape in the earth about the size of a bathtub filled with dead pine needles. I don't know how long I stood there. I kept thinking there was a simple explanation. A previous owner, my uncle himself, but my uncle had been sick for the last 4 years of his life and had barely been up here, and the saplings looked recent, maybe a year or two, maybe less. I left the circle and went back to the cabin and stayed inside until afternoon. What happened that evening I have trouble talking about even now, even though it was 4 years ago. I was on the porch just before dark. The light was doing that golden thing it does in September in Montana, where everything goes amber and the shadows go very long and very blue. I was watching the tree line below the slope when I noticed something standing just inside the trees. At first I took it for a dead snag. It was pale, vertical, and completely still. But then it moved just slightly, just a shift of weight, and I understood it was not a snag. It was tall, taller than a person by maybe 2 feet, though the distance made it hard to be certain. Its proportions were close to human, but not quite right in a way I couldn't immediately specify. I stared at it. It didn't move again. The thing that made me go inside, and I want to be precise here because it still stays with me, was its head. As the light faded and my eyes adjusted, I could see that its head was tilted down toward its chest at an angle that would have been impossible while standing upright, like the neck had been broken or folded. And it was tilted that way with its face aimed at the ground, and yet somehow I was absolutely certain it was looking at me. I went inside. I locked the door, which had no good lock. I sat against the back wall of the cabin with the kitchen knife in my hand and watched the windows go from orange to gray to black. I heard nothing. No sound at all, no wind, no woodpecker, none of the ordinary night sounds I'd fallen asleep to the 2 nights before. Just silence so complete it had texture. When the dawn came, I walked directly to my car and drove away. I didn't pack. I left the food, the duffel, my uncle's box, the journal I never read. I drove the 12 miles of gravel road in about 20 minutes, which is faster than I should have been able to do it. When I got home 3 days later, I found a pine sapling leaning against my apartment door. Its roots were wrapped in damp burlap. There was no note. I live on the 3rd floor of a building with a locked lobby. I have no idea how it got there. I put the property on the market 6 months after that. It hasn't sold. I keep getting told there are interested buyers, and then they fall through at the last minute without explanation. I've stopped asking why. Story 2. I want to preface this by saying I'm not somebody who scares easily. I grew up in a house where my father thought fear was something you outgrew, like believing in Santa Claus, so I trained myself pretty early to push past it. I'm not saying that's healthy. I'm just telling you what kind of person I was going into this. It was late October, the year I was 31. My research partner, Wendell Ackafer, and I had a grant to document lichen species in a section of the Cascades that had been mostly closed to the public since a logging dispute in the 90s. We had permits, we had GPS units that were supposed to work, we had a week's worth of supplies and a truck we'd parked at the end of a closed Forest Service road about 8 miles from where we planned to set up camp. The terrain was not what I'd expected. The maps showed a fairly straightforward series of ridges and valleys, but what we found was more jumbled, like the geology had been interrupted by something. Big chunks of basalt tilted at odd angles, shallow lakes that didn't appear on any map we had. Wendell kept his sense of humor about it better than I did. He had this habit of naming things as we passed them: the leaning rock, the brown lake, the sad tree, which was a fir that had been split partway down by lightning and was somehow still alive, growing in 2 directions from the split. I still think about the sad tree sometimes. We made camp on the second day in a hollow between 2 ridges where there was a small spring and some flat ground. Good spot, good water, sheltered from wind. We'd covered maybe 6 miles, and I felt good about the work we'd done. 40-some specimens catalog, notes on habitat and substrate, some decent photographs. Wendell made coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through an old boot, and we sat outside the tent in the last of the light and talked about nothing in particular. I remember we talked about whether hot dogs counted as sandwiches for a surprisingly long time. I remember the coffee mug I was using had a chip in the rim that kept catching my lip. I don't remember exactly when the feeling started. Sometime that evening, maybe while we were eating, I started feeling observed. That's the only word I have for it. Not frightened, just aware. Like when you're reading in a room and you look up because you somehow know someone's in the doorway, except there was no doorway, just trees. I didn't say anything to Wendell that night. The third day we were cataloging a lichen colony on a north-facing cliff face about a mile from camp. Good specimens, a species I hadn't seen in person before, and I was absorbed in the work. Wendell was a little ways along the cliff face from me. I was crouched down about to take a photograph when I noticed the smell. It's hard to describe, not decay, not skunk, not anything I could place clearly, something between ammonia and wet wood. Wrong in a way that was physical. My throat started to close a little, like a mild allergic reaction. I stood up and looked around, and Wendell looked up at the same time from 30 feet away, and I could tell from his expression that he smelled it too. We didn't say anything. We both just started walking back toward camp. Neither of us brought it up for the rest of that day. The 4th morning I woke up early, 4, maybe 4:30, still dark. I needed to use the bathroom, and I was trying to convince myself I could wait until dawn. I finally gave up and unzipped the tent. The sky had gone that particular shade of dark blue that means maybe an hour before light, and the hollow we were camped in was still in deep shadow. I walked maybe 20 feet from the tent, and that's when I heard it. Breathing, close, maybe 15 feet away in the trees. Not animal breathing, at least not the kind I recognized. The rhythm was off. Too slow for something that size, and there was a quality to it, almost like the breathing was deliberate, like it was being performed rather than just happening. I stopped moving. I stopped making any sound. The breathing continued at exactly the same pace. I made myself look toward it. I can't tell you why. I didn't want to, but I looked. In the space between 2 large pines there was something crouched. Low to the ground, arms folded in tight, not arms folded like a person crossing their arms, but folded back like a bird folding its wings, joints pointing outward. It was pale enough to see even in that light, and its head was broad and low on its shoulders, almost no neck. While I watched, it turned its head, not the way a person turns their head, but very slowly, independently from its body, like an owl swiveling. It turned until it faced me directly. I walked backward to the tent. I did not run because I was afraid of what running might do. I crawled inside and shook Wendell awake, and I spoke to him very quietly. We packed in the dark, as quietly as we could, and we left. We did not speak for the first 2 miles. Then Wendell said, "The smell is gone." It was. Whatever else had changed, the smell was completely gone. We reached the truck and drove out. On the drive, neither of us offered an explanation or a theory, and we've never discussed it since. I don't think we want to name it. Naming it would mean deciding what it was, and I don't think either of us wants to do that. When I went through my field notebook later, I found a page near the end where I'd apparently written something in my sleep or in a state I have no memory of. Just one line in my handwriting that said, "Don't go back for the equipment." I hadn't consciously written that. We had left several $100s worth of equipment at the campsite. Neither of us ever went back for it. Story 3. My sister Priya and I were not speaking to each other when we inherited our grandmother's land up near the Wyoming-Montana border. That's relevant because it meant we had to work together on something neither of us wanted to do, while also not being on great terms, which made the whole thing more tense than it needed to be. The land was about 60 acres of high country just below the tree line, open alpine meadow, some big limestone formations, a stand of old-growth whitebuck pine. Our grandmother had lived there in a small house from the time she was 30 until she died at 89. She had a caretaker, a man named Hensley, who had stayed on the property for the last 10 years or so. When she died, Hensley moved to town and left quickly enough that we had to track him down to get the keys. When we reached him by phone, he was perfectly civil, perfectly helpful. He told us where the spare key was hidden, under the third porch step, the one that creaked, and he walked us through the utilities over the phone, normal stuff. But when Priya asked him why he'd left so suddenly, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You'll understand once you've been there a night," and he hung up. Neither Priya nor I mentioned that conversation again until later. We drove up in mid-June, which should have been beautiful, and was, in a removed kind of way. The alpine meadows were starting to green up. There were wildflowers on the lower slopes. The sky was that specific blue you only get at altitude. I remember I burned the roof of my mouth on a gas station coffee somewhere around Billings, and it bothered me for the whole drive. Small, miserable detail. I also remember Priya's playlist because it was all podcasts about home renovation, and I found it uniquely aggravating. Our grandmother's house was well built and well maintained. Hensley had clearly been thorough about upkeep. Inside it smelled like cedar and something floral I couldn't place. Her things were still everywhere. Her books, her handmade quilts, her collection of small porcelain birds arranged on a shelf in the bedroom. It felt less like a house and more like a museum to someone we hadn't known as well as we should have. We spent the first day going through papers, making an inventory of what was there, talking about what to do with it. Normal, quiet, the kind of tentative peace that happens between people who are disagreeing about something bigger than the task at hand. The second night is when it happened. Priya went to bed early. I sat up reading in the main room, which looked out through a large picture window onto the meadow and the limestone formations beyond. There was a full moon nearly, and the light outside was enough to see by clearly. I put down my book around midnight and sat for a while looking out. The meadow was empty, open ground, a few hundred yards across to the tree line on the far side, nothing moving. The limestone formations were pale and dramatic in the moonlight, clusters of fins and pillars that cast long shadows. I was almost ready to go to bed when I noticed one of the shadows was moving. I kept my eyes on it. It was slow, very slow, but it was definitely moving, and it was moving against the direction of the wind, which was coming from the north and would have pushed a shadow east. This shadow was moving west, toward the house. It took me a long time to accept what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to reassemble it as something normal, a cloud shadow, though the sky was nearly clear, a deer or elk, though the shape was wrong, a trick of moonlight on the limestone. But it kept moving, steadily and slowly, and it didn't match any shadow-casting object I could see. Then the thing casting the shadow stepped out of the shadow itself. It was thin, that's the first thing, absurdly, almost architecturally thin. Its silhouette against the pale meadow grass was a vertical line with slight lateral extensions at shoulder height and hip height. It moved the way a heron moves, with that particular quality of controlled deliberateness, each step considered, each footfall placed exactly. It was crossing the meadow toward the house. I want to be honest about what I did. I did not wake Priya. I got up from the chair and went to the bedroom and sat on the floor with my back against the bed and my knees against my chest, and I waited. I don't know why I didn't wake her. Maybe I thought if only one of us knew about it, it was smaller. That doesn't make sense, but fear often doesn't. I heard it reach the porch, not the creak of the step, just the sound of weight on wood. One step, then nothing. Then it knocked. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced, on the front door. I sat on the floor and didn't move for what felt like a very long time. The knocking didn't come again. When I heard nothing for 30 minutes, I moved to the doorway of the bedroom and looked out at the front door. The window showed the porch in faint moonlight. Nothing there. I could see the meadow beyond, empty. In the morning, I checked the porch. The 3rd step, the one Hensley had told us about, the one that creaked, had left a print in the morning dew. Not a footprint. A long, oval depression, like something had stood there with no differentiated toes, no heel, just a single ovoid contact point, about twice the length of a human foot. I photographed it. By the time Priya got up and I showed her the photo on my phone, the dew had dried and the mark was gone. We called Hensley. He didn't pick up. I've called him 4 more times over the years and he's never picked up. I don't think he will. We sold the property. I don't know what happened to our grandmother's porcelain birds. Priya and I are on better terms now, for whatever that's worth. We just don't talk about the trip. Story 4. There's a section of trail in the San Juan Range of southwestern Colorado that's maintained by a volunteer group out of our array. I was one of those volunteers for about 2 years, chainsaw certified, basic wilderness first aid, weekends in late summer going up to clear blowdown and mark water crossings after the snow melt. It was good work, honest work. I liked the people I worked with. I liked being useful in a landscape that old. This happened on what should have been a routine weekend. I was going up alone, my usual partner. A guy named Felix Arsenault, who'd been doing trail work for 30 years, had a family thing and couldn't make it. There was about a mile of trail just below treeline that needed some log removal and a deteriorating check dam that needed to be rebuilt. 2 days of work, easy, and I'd done it enough times that being alone didn't concern me. I'll tell you the mundane things first because they matter to me somehow. I had a thermos of bad gas station coffee. My work gloves had a split in the left thumb that let in dirt when I grabbed the chainsaw. I'd packed a turkey sandwich I'd made the night before and put in too much mustard. The truck I drove up to the trailhead was borrowed from another volunteer, a woman named Clarice who'd asked me to please not bring it back dirty, and then apologized for asking because it was obviously going to come back dirty. I reached the work section around 9 in the morning. It was overcast, maybe 60 degrees, the kind of muted gray day that's actually perfect for physical labor. I got the blowdown cleared in about 4 hours and ate my sandwich while looking out at a ridge to the south that I'd never gotten a good look at before because usually I was working and not stopping. Nice view. I didn't feel anything unusual. I wasn't apprehensive. I want to be clear about that. I started on the check dam in the early afternoon. It was a fairly simple log structure set across a drainage channel to slow erosion, and several of the anchor logs had shifted and cracked. I worked at it methodically, replacing what needed replacing, and by about 3 I was close to done. That's when I found the first one. Wedged into the gap between 2 anchor logs, as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a bundle of what I first took for sticks. I pulled it out and held it up. 3 small bones tied together with gray fiber I couldn't identify, not synthetic, not plant material I recognized. The bones were small and clean and pale, and they'd been tied in a deliberate geometric arrangement, 2 parallel and 1 crossing them diagonally. I turned it over in my hands for a while. Part of me knew I shouldn't handle it, and part of me was just curious. I set it aside on a rock and kept working. I found 2 more in the next 40 minutes. Same construction, same materials, same careful arrangement. All of them wedged into the structure of the check dam in places that would have been hard to access without tools. I told myself someone had put them there as a joke or as some kind of ritual thing. There are people who do that kind of thing in wild places. I left them where I'd set them and started packing up to make camp. The camp I'd chosen was a flat spot maybe 300 feet from the trail, sheltered by a rock outcrop. I'd camped there before, not many times, but enough to know it was comfortable. I set up my tent, got water from a creek 20 feet away, and made dinner as the light faded. The overcast had thickened into actual cloud cover, very low, and by the time I finished eating, I couldn't see more than about 30 feet in any direction. I was in my tent maybe an hour after dark when I heard the knocking. Not knocking like on a door. Knocking like stone on stone, hollow and clear, about 4 times, pausing, then 4 more. Evenly spaced. Coming from somewhere to my left, back toward the rock outcrop. I told myself it was a branch moving in the wind. The pattern was too regular for a branch. I told myself maybe it was rock fall. Rock fall doesn't knock 4 times and stop and then knock 4 times again. I lay very still and counted the repetitions. It happened 6 times, 4 knocks, pause, 4 knocks, then it stopped. 15 minutes of silence. I started to relax, then something touched the tent. Not pushed, not clawed, touched. From the outside, a slow pressure at the level of my right shoulder. Deliberate, light, like a hand resting against the nylon, feeling for something. I froze. The pressure was still there. Then it moved upward slowly toward the tent peak. Then it was gone. I did not sleep. I sat upright until the light changed to gray, and then I packed in the fastest I've ever packed. I had the tent down in about 90 seconds. I've timed myself since, and that's genuinely fast. I grabbed everything, and I mean everything, and I moved. I was maybe 100 yards from the campsite when I had to stop and catch my breath. I looked back toward where the tent had been. The rock outcrop was no longer visible in the low cloud. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could hear faintly the stone-on-stone knocking starting again. 4 knocks, pause. I walked very fast back to the trailhead. I didn't run, but I didn't stop. I reached Clarice's truck, and I'm sorry, Clarice, it was dirty when I brought it back. Later, looking at my notes about the trail work, I realized something. The bones I'd found in the check dam, all 3 bundles were gone when I walked past on my way out. I hadn't moved them. I'd left them on the rocks beside the dam. They were gone. And in the soil near the check dam, now soft from yesterday's work, there were impressions I hadn't made, narrow, elongated, 4-toed but wrong, pointing toward where my camp had been. I still do trail work. Different section now. Story 5. My brother-in-law Gideon has a saying that bad decisions made slowly are still bad decisions. I thought about that a lot during the week I spent alone in the Adirondacks at the age of 29, which I arrived at through a very slow series of bad decisions that all seemed fine at the time. The long version is that I'd been going through something, I won't get into what, and I decided that what I needed was solitude and open space and no cell service and a chance to sit with myself for a few days. The slightly shorter version is that I rented a small cabin near the upper end of a privately owned forest holding in Essex County, New York, and I drove there in November when any reasonable person would have said that was an irrational choice for someone in my particular mental state. The cabin was nice, actually. Small but well-maintained, propane heat, a solid wood stove, good water from a drilled well. The owner, a woman named Tessie Braun, whose family had held the land for 4 generations, had left a binder of information on the kitchen table. Quiet hours, the location of the nearest hospital, what to do if the propane ran out. At the back of the binder was a hand-drawn map of the trails on the property. Several of them were marked with X's. When I called to ask about the X's, she was quiet for a moment and then said those trails weren't maintained and I should stick to the ones that were. I said I would. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd wanted. Cold, quiet, the kind of quiet that's actually loud when you stop fighting it, wind in bare branches, ice forming on the edges of a pond maybe a half-mile south, the wood stove making small adjustments as the wood burned down. I read. I slept too much. I ate canned soup for dinner twice in a row without caring. I felt slowly like the pressure behind my sternum was loosening. On the third morning, I took a walk. I followed one of the marked trails east and then, for no good reason other than the trail ended at a viewpoint I'd already seen, I turned off it and went north into unmarked forest. It was fine for a while. The trees were mostly second-growth maple and beech, bare for November, and I could see a reasonable distance. The snow was thin and old and crusted, about 4 inches, and I could see my own footprints behind me clearly. I walked maybe a mile north before the terrain started to rise and I picked a high point to aim for. I found the hollow maybe 200 feet below the high point. It was a depression in the hillside, maybe 20 feet across and 6 feet deep, with walls that were unnaturally smooth, not the rough irregularity of normal terrain but a consistent curve, like the inside of a bowl. The floor was perfectly flat, nothing grew in it. Not the first year's leaf litter, not moss, not even the thin snow that covered everything else. Just bare, hard-packed soil the color of dried ash. I stood at the edge and looked down into it. I didn't go in. I'm not sure why I told myself the sides looked steep, but they weren't really. I just didn't want to. That was the first time in 2 days I'd felt anything like the old pressure behind my sternum. I turned around and went back. I didn't sleep well that night and I couldn't have told you why. I kept waking up and listening. The wind had dropped completely and the cabin was very quiet except for the wood stove. Around 3 in the morning I heard a sound outside that I placed after a moment as footsteps in the snow, measured, slow, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I counted 3 full circuits before they stopped. In the morning I looked at the snow. There were marks there, but they were strange, not footprints with defined toes and heel, but oblong scuffs, as if something had been sliding its feet rather than lifting them. The pattern was consistent with something walking, but the individual impressions were wrong. Each one was about the right length for a human footprint, but perfectly flat, no arch, no digital impression, just an even oval of compressed snow. The tracks came from the direction of the hollow and stopped at the base of the porch steps without going up. They didn't go away from the cabin, they simply ended. I added wood to the wood stove and sat in the chair closest to it and didn't feel the cold I should have been feeling. The 4th night was the one I can't get through cleanly in the telling. I was reading late when the propane light over the table flickered and went low. Gas running out. I thought Tessie had said to check the gauge and I hadn't. I got my headlamp and went outside to the propane tank on the side of the cabin. The gauge showed 3/4 full. I turned the valve slightly and the pressure improved. I went back inside and the light was fine. I was at the door when I heard the voice. It was coming from the tree line, maybe 70 feet from the cabin. A woman's voice, low and rhythmic, saying something I couldn't make out. Not calling to me, not addressing me, just saying something in a steady murmur, like reading aloud to herself. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I went inside and closed and latched the door and pushed the kitchen table against it, which was irrational, but I did it. The voice continued for, I think, about 20 minutes. Then it stopped. I did not go outside until full daylight. When I looked at the binder of information Tessie had left, really looked at it this time, I found something I'd missed before. On the back of the last page, in pencil so light I'd overlooked it, was a note in her handwriting. If you hear someone in the trees at night, do not answer and do not go out. That was it. No explanation. I called her that morning. She answered. I asked her about the note and she said, "You found that." Not a question. I asked what it meant. She said, "It means what it says." And then, before I could ask more, she said, "Did you go near the hollow?" I said yes. She was quiet. Then she said, "How close?" I told her ID stood at the edge. She said, "Good, don't go back." I left that morning. I still have the binder. I took it when I left, which wasn't right of me, I know. But I needed the proof that the note was real. I look at it sometimes, that pencil line on the back of the last page. It's not the handwriting of someone who expects to be asked about it. It's the handwriting of someone who's accepted that some things need to be said and some things can't be explained. Story 6. Growing up in a small town in the Blue Ridge, everybody has a story about Slate Knob. It's a rounded granite dome about 4 miles east of town, high enough to see from the main road on a clear day, and the stories about it have been around long enough that nobody remembers where they started. Teenagers dared each other to camp there. One family I knew refused to let their kids even talk about it. An old man named Vernon Caudle, who had grown up on a farm at the foot of the knob, told my father once that his grandfather had seen something up there in the 1920s that made him give up the farm and move to Greensboro. He never said what. I was 36 before I finally went up. I was doing landscape photography at the time, semi-professionally, meaning I had a website and occasionally sold prints. But mostly it was an expensive hobby that my wife Ramona tolerated with impressive grace. I'd heard that the sunrise from the top of Slate Knob was extraordinary, and I'd been procrastinating about it for years. Finally, on a Thursday in October, I told myself I was being ridiculous and drove to the trailhead. The hike up was about 2.5 miles, not difficult. I set out before dawn with my camera pack, a tripod, a thermos of coffee. The trail goes through second-growth hardwood for the first 1.5 miles, then breaks into the open rocky slope for the final stretch to the dome. I'd walked it in my mind so many times it felt slightly anticlimactic. Just a trail, just woods, just the ordinary sounds of an October morning. At the tree line where the trail breaks onto the open slope, there's a wooden sign post. Most of the sign was gone. Weather and time had reduced it to the post and some fragments of board with illegible letters. But someone had wedged a newer piece of wood into the crack at the top of the post. It was pale and freshly cut, and on it someone had scratched a single symbol, not a letter from any alphabet I recognized, but a shape like a closed eye with lines radiating from its center. Knew enough that the wood was still slightly damp where the tool had cut. I photographed it because it was interesting and moved on. The summit was everything I'd hoped for photographically. The light came up clean and gold, and the view was clear in 3 directions. I spent maybe 2 hours up there working, checking exposures, repositioning the tripod. I was absorbed in it, really in it, the way you get when the work is going well. I almost didn't notice the other person. He was standing at the far edge of the dome, maybe 60 feet away, facing away from me and looking out over the valley. I'd been so focused on the light that I'd stopped attending to my surroundings. I felt a flash of irritation. I'd wanted the summit to myself, and then a small embarrassment at feeling that. I watched him for a moment. He was very still, just standing there in what looked like dark clothing, hands at his sides. I went back to my work and was lining up another shot about 15 minutes later when I looked up and he was much closer, maybe 25 feet away now, still facing away from me, same posture, same absolute stillness. The light was better now, full sunrise, and I could see him more clearly. His hair was wrong. It was moving slightly, but the wind had died at sunrise and there was nothing to move it. It moved independently, strands separating and resettling in a way that looked like slow breathing. I cleared my throat. He didn't react. I said good morning at normal speaking volume, nothing. I started packing my tripod slowly, watching him. He didn't move. I had everything packed in about 3 minutes. I picked up my bag and took 1 step toward the trail, and that's when he turned. He turned not by rotating at the waist or the shoulders the way you'd expect, but by pivoting on one heel like a post in the ground, his whole body rotating as a unit. His face, I'm going to tell you this straight, his face was wrong in a way I still can't fully describe. The features were there, all the features a face should have, but the proportions were somehow inconsistent, like the face itself disagreed with itself, like each part of it was following a slightly different set of rules. He was looking at me, or the face was pointed at me. The eyes didn't track. They were just aimed in my direction while the face slowly arranged itself into something like an expression. I turned and walked down the trail, not running. I walked fast and did not look back, and I counted my own footsteps to keep myself from doing anything stupid. When I got to my car and loaded my gear, I checked the SD card in my camera out of habit. The photos from the morning were there, the light, the views, the beautiful, ordinary geography of the valley. And in 3 of the photos from when I'd first arrived, before I'd noticed the figure at all, you could see a shape in the tree line below the summit. Long and pale, visible only in 2 of the frames because it had moved between shots. It had been watching me from the tree line before I even reached the top. I still have those photographs. My wife Ramona has seen them. She's not the kind of person who spends a lot of time worrying about things she can't change. But she asked me not to go back to Slate Knob, and I haven't. Story 7. The summer I worked trail crew in the Wallowa Mountains of eastern Oregon was the best and worst summer of my adult life. Best because the work was good and the mountains were extraordinary, and I was 22 and stupid in the specific productive way you're stupid at 22. Worst because of what happened in the 3rd week of the contract. There were 6 of us on the crew. I'll give you the relevant ones. Our crew lead, a woman named Soledad Varga, who had been doing this work for 12 years and ran the crew with total competence and 0 tolerance for drama. A guy named Birch, who was maybe 19 and had the energy of a person who had never been tired, and a woman named Kezia Almont, my tent neighbor, who was quiet and kept to herself, and had, I later found out, a degree in ethnobotany that she never mentioned because she thought it would invite questions she didn't want to answer. We were working a section of trail that had been closed since a slide 3 years earlier. The objective was to reopen about 4 miles of it, clear the debris, re-establish tread, put in new drainage structures. 3 weeks of work for a crew our size, weather permitting. We were in the 2nd week when we found the camp. It was off-trail by maybe 200 yards down a steep bank from where we were working. Birch found it. He'd gone off to use the bathroom, which was always a good excuse in those days to poke around, and he came back and said we needed to see something. The camp was old enough that the tent, or what was left of it, had deteriorated into something that looked more like a dark patch on the ground than an object. The poles were still standing, or 2 of them were, the fabric rotted away and hanging from them in scraps. A cook pot, green with oxidation. A camp chair, collapsed but recognizable. And surrounding all of it, about 10 feet out in every direction, a ring of small cairns. Not the kind of cairns you build to mark a trail. These were precise, 3 stones each, always exactly 3, arranged in a perfect alignment. There were 11 of them evenly spaced. One was disturbed, knocked over, the 3 stones scattered as if someone had kicked it in passing. The others were intact. Soledad looked at it for a while and then said we should go back to the trail and get back to work, which we did. But over lunch, she mentioned that she'd heard a story about this section, a solo hiker who'd gone missing up here in the late 90s and been listed as a rescue case that never got resolved. She wasn't connecting dots, just mentioning it. Birch made a joke about it being a different kind of missing, and Soledad gave him the look she used when something wasn't funny, and he stopped. That night we were camped about a mile from the old camp. I woke up around 2 with the absolute certainty that something was wrong with the quality of the silence around the tent. I've camped enough to know there's a baseline of sound even in very quiet places. Insects if it's warm enough, wind, the small movements of small animals. What I was hearing was nothing. A total cessation, the kind of quiet that isn't natural. I opened the tent vestibule quietly and looked out. The camp was in a small meadow, trees on 3 sides. The moon was new and the dark was genuine, deep, the kind you only get in mountains with no artificial light for 30 miles. I could make out the shapes of the other tents, solidads and birches, the cook kit under the tarp. Everything looked normal. Then I heard the first sound. From the trees on the north side of the meadow, a single clear, sharp knock like a stone hitting wood, hard enough that I felt it in my teeth. Silence. Then from the south side, the same knock. Exact same sound. Exact same volume. They were communicating, 2 of them, one on either side of our camp. The knock came again from the north, then immediately from the south, then north, then south. Back and forth, steady, spaced about 15 seconds apart. I sat in the tent vestibule and didn't move. Kezia's voice came from the tent next to me, just barely a whisper. She said, "Don't make any sound and don't use your light." I didn't answer. She asked me not to make any sound. The knocking continued for maybe 20 minutes, then it simply stopped. No fading, no last response from one side, just cessation. In the morning, nobody talked about it at breakfast. Not me, not Kezia. Birch was asleep when it happened and didn't know. Soledad was, I'm not sure. She looked tired. She may have heard it. I never asked. When we went back to the trail that day, I walked past the place where the bank dropped down toward the old camp. I could see the tops of the 2 poles from the trail. And sitting on the bank, right at the edge, as if left there deliberately, was one of the cairns from the circle. 3 stones, precisely aligned, sitting on the dirt of the trail we'd cleared. None of us had moved it. None of us had been down that bank since the day before. Soledad picked it up, looked at it, and dropped it back off the bank. She didn't say anything. We kept working. I finished out the contract. The trail reopened. I got paid and drove home and slept for 2 days. I still do trail work sometimes. I've been back to the Wallowers twice since then on different contracts, different sections. I've never gone back to that specific stretch. I don't know if the old camp is still there. I don't intend to find out. Story 8. I need to tell you about the summer my wife and I drove up into the Sawatch Range to spread her father's ashes, because that's the only way the rest of it makes sense. Her father, Rowan Hess, had been a geologist and an amateur mountaineer, and had spent substantial portions of his working life in the mountains of central Colorado. He asked, in a letter we found after he died, to have his ashes spread at a specific location, a saddle between 2 unnamed peaks above 12,000 feet, near a small town he'd visited many times over the course of his career. He'd drawn a map, old-fashioned, hand-drawn with compass bearings and landmarks. My wife Carla carried it in her jacket pocket for the whole hike and checked it every quarter mile or so like it was something she might lose. This was September, late September, which is late to be in the high country, but not dangerously so if the weather holds, and we'd checked the forecast carefully. We parked at a trailhead on a forest road and hiked 6 miles to the saddle. It took most of the day because the elevation gain was substantial and Carla needed to stop frequently, which she doesn't usually and which I understood without saying anything about it. Grief does that. The saddle was beautiful, that's important to say. The tarn was maybe an acre, perfectly still, reflecting the sky at an angle that made it look like a portal to somewhere. There was a low rock windbreak someone had built years ago, and we sat inside it, and Carla did what she'd come to do, and I stayed quiet and held her hand, and it was the right thing for the right reasons in the right place, and I was glad we'd come. We stayed longer than we'd planned. The light started going around 4:30, and we knew we should move. Carla took a long time to leave. I understood. The thing is, on the way down we were moving faster than we'd come up. Altitude loss, urgency of fading light, and we missed the junction where the trail switched back south. Didn't realize it for maybe 20 minutes. By the time we understood we'd passed it, we were in unfamiliar terrain in deteriorating light. Carla had the map, but it wasn't detailed enough to help much. I had a GPS unit that gave us our coordinates, but I couldn't match them well enough to the hand-drawn markings to be confident. We decided to stay on the contour and try to hit the main trail lower down rather than backtrack uphill in the dark. That was probably the second bad decision of the evening. We worked along the hillside for maybe half a mile. It was slow going, loose rock, some steep sections, and the light was nearly gone by the time we found a wide flat area with some sheltered spots. I was about to say we should just make do here until morning when Carla stopped walking. She said, "There's a light." I looked where she was looking. Down the slope, maybe a quarter mile, a pale light was moving slowly through the trees. Not a campfire, too mobile, too consistent. Not a headlamp, too diffuse, more like a pale glow than a beam. It moved steadily westward along what might have been a contour trail. I made the decision that seemed obviously right at the time: follow it. If someone was down there with a light, it meant people, it meant possibly the trail we'd lost, it meant a way out of the dark. We started toward it and it stayed at about the same distance. Not retreating, not advancing, just moving at the same steady pace. I want to say it was aware of us. That feels right, but I have no specific evidence for that. We followed it for what I estimated was about 40 minutes, and then it stopped. We were in a dense stand of spruce. Carla was behind me, her hand on my shoulder. The light was directly ahead, maybe 50 feet, between two large trees. Still, stationary for the first time. I looked at it and could make out no source, no lantern, no flashlight, no fire. Just a hovering, pale luminosity about the size of a large window, maybe 5 feet off the ground. Carla said very quietly, "That's where we are." I didn't understand what she meant. She pointed past the light. I looked. We were at the trailhead, the Forest Service kiosk, the brown wooden signpost, the trailhead register in its little metal box. All of it was right there, 20 feet beyond where the light stood. We'd been led directly to our starting point from terrain we'd never navigated before. When I looked back for the light, it was gone. I've turned that over in my head many times since then. Maybe it was ball lightning. Maybe there's some atmospheric phenomenon in the Sawatch that I don't know about. Maybe it was something to do with Rowan. That's what Carla thinks, though she says it gently, not insistently. What I come back to is this: it found us in the dark. It walked in front of us for 40 minutes. It stopped at exactly the right place. In the morning, back at the trailhead, I noticed something on the wooden post that held the register box. A line of small divots, 3 of them pressed into the wood at eye height, like a fingerprint left in something harder than a fingerprint should be able to press. I don't know when they were made. I photographed them. I don't know what the light was. I'm genuinely not trying to lead you somewhere with that. I just don't know. Story 9. When my cousin Deo and I decided to do the 4-day loop in the Sangre de Cristo wilderness, we were not, looking back, adequately prepared. Not for the physical part. We'd both done comparable trips and we had good gear. What we weren't prepared for was the specific quality of that country, which has a weight to it that doesn't come through in photographs or trail descriptions or any of the things you can read before you go. The Sangres are old mountains. That's not a poetic statement. It's the geological reality. They're some of the oldest exposed range in the Rockies, and there's something about being in very old country that impresses itself on you in a physical way. The silence there has layers. I don't know how else to say it. We started on a Monday. Day 1 was straightforward, a well-marked trail, good weather. We made 17 miles and were pleased with ourselves. Day 2, we dropped into a drainage I can't find a name for on any map and followed it north, and the landscape changed. The trees grew more dense, the drainage cut deeper, the trail became faint in places. We found the note on the afternoon of day 2. It was on a trail register box at a junction we almost missed. Most of the entries were the usual dates, party sizes, trail conditions. The last entry was in handwriting that was harder to read than the others, cramped and uneven, dated about 3 weeks before our trip. It said, "Turn back at the second tributary. Something crosses the trail there at night. Waited until dawn. Still not okay." That was it. No name, no party size. I read it twice and showed it to Deo, who is, like me, a person who prefers rational explanations. She read it, handed it back, and said, "Could be a bear." I said, "Probably." We kept going. The second tributary was maybe 4 miles further. We reached it around late afternoon and made camp on the near side, not because of the note, I told myself, but because it was a good campsite. Good water, flat ground, a rock wall at our backs. That night I lay awake listening for a long time before I admitted I was listening for something specific. The sound started maybe an hour after we'd gone into the tent. A low sound, not loud, coming from the direction of the creek. Not running water, the creek was small and quiet, something else. A low, continuous vocalization, almost like a hum, but with variance in it, a subtle rising and falling that wasn't monotone but wasn't melodic either. It was the sound of something making a sound. I can't be more precise. Dea was awake. I could tell from her breathing. Neither of us spoke. The sound moved. Slowly, traveling along the near bank of the creek, then crossing. I could hear the slight change as it crossed, and then continuing up the far side. It passed our camp at maybe 20 feet and didn't pause, just moved through. In the morning, we crossed the tributary. On the near bank where the sound had passed, the vegetation was flattened in a band maybe 4 feet wide, as if something had traveled that path recently and regularly. And pressed into the mud at the water's edge were marks, not clear footprints, more like long, shallow gouges, as if something had moved through the mud without fully lifting its weight. 3 sets. Whatever made them moved on 4 points, but the spacing and depth were inconsistent with any quadruped I could identify. Deo photographed them. She studied them for a long time without speaking. Finally she said, "I want to keep moving." I agreed. We made good time that day and the day after. Nothing happened on the 3rd night. On the 4th morning, we were on the final stretch toward the trailhead when I realized we had not seen any other people, no day-hikers, no other backpackers for the entire loop. In prime shoulder season, on a listed wilderness route. That seems significant in a way I can't articulate precisely. The last thing, and this is the part that still bothers Deo more than me, was that when we reached the trailhead and the parking lot, there were 2 vehicles there besides our own. Both were dusty enough to have been there for days. Both were locked. Deo wrote down the license plates, intending to report them to the ranger station. When we stopped at the station on the way out, we described the vehicles and gave the plates. The ranger, a young guy who seemed very fresh, not like someone who'd been in that country long, listened and said he'd check on it. He took down our numbers. Nobody ever called. I think about those vehicles sometimes. I think about who left them there and when, and whether they came back by a different way or whether they just didn't come back. I think about the note in the register, the cramped handwriting, still not okay. I don't have an ending for this story. I wish I did. Story 10. The last thing I'll tell you, and maybe the one I've had the hardest time finding words for, is about the summer my grandmother's cabin in the Bitterroot burned and I went to deal with the aftermath. This is different from the other stories in this collection because I'm not entirely sure I believe my own account of it. I want to be honest about that up front. What happened might have been grief. My grandmother had died 4 months before the fire and I hadn't fully processed it, and I know grief does things to perception. But what I saw, and what I found afterward doesn't have a grief-based explanation. I drove up to the property on a Tuesday in late July. The cabin was a total loss. The fire had been investigated and ruled accidental. A wiring fault in the wall near the old wood stove. What was left was the foundation, the stone chimney, and some of the larger structural timbers, charred but standing. Everything else was gone. My grandmother's books, her photographs, her collection of copper molds she'd hung on the kitchen wall. Gone. I spent the first day just walking the perimeter, not doing anything practical. I had a contractor coming later in the week for the structure, just looking, processing, I suppose. The smell of old burn hangs in a place for a long time, and the smell of that specific burn, which smelled somehow like my grandmother's kitchen had, was harder to be near than I'd anticipated. I was staying in my truck. I'd brought a sleeping pad and a bag for the bed, and that first night was fine. Heavy and sad and fine. The second day I walked the property boundary the way my grandmother had walked it with me when I was young. Northeast to the split pine, along the ridge, down through the rock garden to the spring, back up through the meadow. She'd known every inch of this land with the specific intimacy of someone who'd worked it for 50 years, who named individual rocks and trees and knew their seasons. I thought about her constantly. I talked to her some out loud, which embarrassed me even with no one to hear it. At the spring, I found a small thing that I'd have called hers if I hadn't known the cabin had burned. A circle of rounded river stones, carefully arranged on the flat rock beside the spring outlet. She used to make things like that, small arrangements of natural objects, no particular purpose, just the habit of an ordered mind encountering beautiful material. It was the kind of thing she would have made. It hadn't been there 6 months ago. I'd visited the property in February, and the river stones, there was no river near enough to account for them. The spring outlet was a trickle into a small catch pool. The nearest river rock would have been miles away. I sat by the spring for a long time. I want to be careful about what I'm claiming. I'm not claiming it was her. I don't know what it was. What I know is that when I walked back toward the ruin of the cabin, I heard my name spoken. Once, clearly, in a voice that was my grandmother's voice, her specific pitch and cadence, her way of saying my name. From somewhere in the meadow to my left, I stopped and I listened. The meadow was empty. There was wind in the grass. There was nothing. I stood there for a long time, and then I walked back to the truck and sat in the driver's seat and cried in the ugly way you cry when you've been trying not to for a long time. I'm still not sure what I want to say about that voice. Some days it feels like comfort, and some days it feels like a warning, and some days it feels like evidence of something I should be frightened of, and I can't always tell which feeling is accurate. What I can tell you is this. When the contractor came and we were clearing the site, he found something in the debris that shouldn't have survived the fire. On the stone hearth, which had been exposed to the full intensity of the burn, there was a small copper mold, one of my grandmother's collection, a fish shape I'd known since childhood, completely intact, not even discolored, sitting in the exact center of the stone as if someone had placed it there deliberately. The contractor photographed it and gave it to me without comment. I have it on my kitchen shelf. I look at it most mornings. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it means anything. I just know it was there and it shouldn't have been, and whoever, whatever, put it there knew what it was to me. Maybe that's all there is to say. Thanks for watching and for staying with me through all 10 of these tonight. These stories stay with me too, long after the telling, and I hope they stay with you in the way that good unsettling things do, keeping you curious about what's out there in those high, quiet places. If one of these got under your skin, let me know in the comments. I read every one. Like and subscribe if you want more, and share this with whoever you know who keeps their light on a little longer than they need to. Until next time, take care of yourselves and stay on the marked trails.